Well, so welcome everyone to this Life Itself, Second Renaissance podcast with Zak Stein, who is co-founder at the Civilizational Research Institute and also co-founder at the Center for World Philosophy and Religion. And I think it's fair to say is one of the leading lights in this kind of area, or whatever this space is kind of emerging around the meta crisis, metamodernism, the second renaissance, this time between worlds, which is a phrase that Zak himself, I feel, kind of coined, or at least brought very fully into the discourse. So thank you, Zak, for joining me today.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. It's good to see you.
Yeah. It's been a while since we last talked. I guess I would start out by saying what you've been doing quite a lot of work recently and talking about Value, the new book that you've kind of co-authored under the name David Temple, I think, with Mark Gaffney and Ken Wilber. Can you say a little bit, just to start with, like, in a kind of nutshell, what's the kind of thesis of that, and what's also motivating you in the work what is it you're seeing that's really motivating setting this out? So maybe start with the kind of thesis in a nutshell.
I mean, the general thing that links the two projects, Civilizational Research Institute, World Philosophy and Religion, would be a concern with the meta crisis and thinking about what it would mean to get civilization into a situation that wasn't suicidal and self-destructive to the extent that this one is. So how do you navigate the meta crisis? And a big part of that is what might be called superstructure, which just means worldviews. What are the most basic assumptions about how the world works? And even more specifically, how do the people who have the most power and influence, how do they think what the nature of the world is? And what is being told to the people from the kind of centers of power and knowledge, what's being told to people about what they should think about themselves and think about the universe? And for a long time, there had been a belief for most of human history that the universe was full of meaning, that the universe was full of value, which meant that my group or my family, my nation was somehow supposed to be in the universe, right? That humanity was supposed to be in the universe, that there was an intrinsic value to the cosmos, to the universe. With the emergence in the West of this thing we call modernity, you get a group of people who talk everyone out of that idea. David Hume is an exemplary case of this, who basically start to say, no, the universe is meaningless. The universe is just matter in motion. The universe is just causality. It's just things bumping into one another. The notion of free will, the notion of value, the notion of ethics, even our science, it's just, from a human perspective, can't even really explain science. So there's this move that's made where the dominant cultural narrative goes from one, which for better or worse, saturated the world with a certain type of value and meaning. Now that also creates a whole bunch of problems. We could talk about the pre-modern way that the field of value is discussed. But modernity convinces, now we're in the situation where with late post-modernity, in this time between worlds, where one of the major projects is reconstructing value, which means it's a counter-revolution, actually, which is to say, like, we're not the radical ones for arguing that value is ontically real, meaning to arguing that value exists in the universe, that it preceded humanity, that the clarified desire and need of the human discloses value that is not merely relative or a social construction. As McGilchrist says, biological life emerges in pursuit of value. So similar to that, you could posit consciousness as equally primordial with time, space, matter, motion. You can posit value as primordial to cosmos. That's been the longstanding view. Actually, it's been understood as more primary than matter for a long time. But we're in a situation now of having to actually talk people back into the belief that their actions matter, that they have choice, that there are better and worse choices, that value exists, that value is not a social construction, that value is not relative. And therefore, being completely out of touch with value would be dangerous. And that's what the meta crisis shows us. You know, the meta crisis is a profound misunderstanding of the nature of what is valuable. And we're pursuing an abstract definition of value, quantitative, financialized value, at the detriment of the actually embodied intrinsic value that is destroyed to create tokens of abstract fungible value. You see, so we're like taking the living field of value and destroying it for the sake of abstract pseudo value. So it's a very profound misunderstanding of what value is. So we've started in the project of David J. Temple to bring forward the work that kind of Gaffney and Wilbur and I have been doing for some time. You know, I've been a student of Gaffney's for a long time, and also a student of Ken's work, but you know, I've been very close with Gaffney and cooking these ideas for a long time, stepping into the co-presidency of the center, getting involved in this, writing the decision to make this quasi-pseudonym, we're not really hiding behind the name, but is to create an entity that could be multiple authored and then eventually outlive the existing authors to create like a band. It's like a band name. That's how I say it. And the goal there is to begin this project of the reconstruction of value, right? And to look at the claims made by the counter-revolutionaries carefully, to look at the state of the existing science, and just kind of like begin to tamp down this revolution against value, which has been part of modernity. Now there's two streams in modernity. There's the cold stream, which I've mentioned, it's the Humean stream. And then there's this warm stream in modernity, which you could associate with like Comenius and Kant, and then like kind of Hegel, Schelling, and the German idealists, the romantics eventually, who have a different view and who kind of try to maintain that value is real. But the cold stream of modernity got super involved in measurement and technology and kind of built a lot of stuff. and so they have dominated the discourse, you know, wildly. So it's not a general condemnation of modernity, but it is a sense that we have a very distorted worldview right now. And so that's one way to think about this work in this project. And what you're focusing on with the Renaissance is exactly that. There's this notion, which something like what's called a civilizational transvaluation, which is just a fancy way of saying like not some set of values that changes, but the way one talks about value itself changes. So the very fundamental backdrop of our languages of strong evaluation begins to change. And so that's what's occurring. It is what is occurring now. It's just we're in the middle of it. So it's quite confusing. And unfortunately, when this occurred in previous contexts, usually you get a collapse of lower levels of the civilizational stack for a while, a dark age, where the infrastructure and social structure begin to come apart. And we had planetary infrastructure and social structure with catastrophic and existential fail states, meaning we can't go through the same type of civilizational collapse while we do this civilizational transvaluation. So that's a complicated and very, very dangerous situation. So the reconstruction of value is the way we're doing it. And we're characterizing it as part of a project of neo-perennialism. So we're making the argument that the great lineage traditions, when well understood, and that's a complex phrase, yield an already existing discourse that assumes value as real, assumes that the clarified human will and mind and desire can be in touch with actual value in reality. We call that anthro-ontology. So there's a whole opening in the neo-perennialists, what we call evolving perennialism, which we hope can also resuscitate some of the lineage traditions to be able to meet the moment, basically. Habermas talks a lot about that. He talks about the untapped semantic potentials that still lay dormant in the great world religious traditions. And that's true. And so our project is that, figuring out how to relanguage it, how to make it contemporary, conversative with science, conversative with postmodernism, make an unassailable new language that re-ontologizes value. We talk about a universal grammar of value as a context for its unique expression. So, because there's also the postmodern critiques of value, which are the cultural relativist, how dare you impose
Yes.
your value on me critiques, which are completely valid in many cases. So you have to take on the scientific critique of value and then take on the postmodern critique of value. And then you see that value stands, it just becomes more complex. And so that's what this book is. It's an attempt to create kind of a new reconstruction of value. And so I'll stop. I just said a lot. There was quite a lot in there. So thank you.
It's a long, succinct, just also for listeners, because I didn't say it, this book, well, there's several pieces Zak has written, but the joint book is called First Principles and First Values, 42 Propositions on Cosmoerotic Humanism, the Meta Crisis, and the World, I think, to come. So I just wanted to dig in there maybe on a couple of points. So just so I summarize it back, I'm hearing a bit, it's a crucial kind of the core thesis here is around value, which is that we live in a world, a modern or postmodern world, where essentially, what we mean by value is like, hey, everything's sort of subjective. There's no absolute value, there's no good, there's no beautiful, there's just kind of opinion.
Right. Yep.
And that fundamentally the claim is no, value is real. Now it's subtle. It's not like we're not saying like something you could see, but it's something that you can sense and it's ontically real. It's an aspect of this universe, and that also this loss, kind of secondarily, I hear is like this loss of our ability, or this kind of like this delusion we're living in that there isn't this value, and our inability therefore to sense it or to kind of develop our capacity to sense it and follow it, are also kind of key to some of the breakdown socially, and kind of the meta crisis and the major risks we face. So just to ask a little bit on that, I mean, one question I have is, I've just been, I'm very present to this too, but I give a concrete example. We've been doing some work with architects because we're building a kind of transformative village. And, literally I did this test, like every architect I went to were like, is there better or worse architecture? Or are there more beautiful or less beautiful buildings? They were all like, no. It's just what you feel like, what you like or whatever. This exact kind of test. So they couldn't find a single Christopher Alexander architect, basically. My question though to you is like, what would you say to them? How do you say this to people who are in that space, who aren't already kind of sensing this? What are the kind of way in sharing this to people who kind of like, no, that, or even, that would be oppressive even, or whatever it is?
Exactly. Yeah, it's a very important point. So there's a few ways in. So one way to think about it is that the architect certainly believes there are universals with regards to things like gravity and the tensor strength of material, friction, and things like that, right? So the architect is not a radical constructivist, which you do find in postmodernists who believe that, in fact, even the physical laws of nature explored by science are not real. Maybe we're in a simulation, or I don't know what they think how engineering works, but assume that the stance is taken that things like gravity are real, and allow for continuous learning with regards to it, and therefore education is possible with regards to the physical world. You could become an architect, and you could be a bad architect who would build a building that falls down. But then there's this other thing, which is value, which is the beauty or goodness, appropriateness of the thing, the kind of this other dimension, which is assumed to not be real in some way, the way, not like gravity is. The gravity is
it's not like gravity, right?
This thing is not real. So that's a very important point, is that they're not denying that things are real. They're denying that this certain class of things are real. And therefore and then there's a bunch of implications to that, which they're actually not willing to onboard. So that's where I go. So I go to the places where they get stuck in performative contradiction, which means that implied in that stance, that discourses about gravity are reasonable and education about physical reality is possible, but discourses about value are arbitrary, and therefore all education about value is propaganda. Implied in that stance is the impossibility of actually doing science and architecture. Now, they don't realize that. There's also the impossibility in that stance of actually raising their kids. So that's one
Yes.
of the places I go with really problematic worldviews. And it's just demonstrably not true, like in terms of any critical exploration of the reliability of certain things being deemed as good cross-culturally is actually pretty easy to do. Smiles are very universal. Certain ratios and proportions are very universally aesthetically pleasing. Other ones are very universally seen as scary. And so, yeah, I think it's basically a very common cop-out in our culture because of the, well, a couple things. One is the absence of a coherent metaphysical worldview that could account for the reality of value. So if you like, because where is it? Where is it? Right.
Where is it? Where I can't touch it. I can't measure it.
Exactly. So you feel gravity. On your body, you can feel gravity. If you build a structure, you can watch gravity.
Yes.
Gravity is invisible. It manifests away. So there's that basic difficulty of having to get someone in a position to open their eye of value. Right? The eye of the senses allows us to see the physical laws of nature, and we do education with regards to that. There's also this eye of value, and it's just a different capacity, essentially, which doesn't go away, and he's using it all the time, even though rhetorically he denies it. And that's the trick, is that you, just like you can't escape gravity, you can't somehow escape gravity. You can go to outer space, but you're still in the range of gravitational field.
Yes.
You cannot escape the field of value. Even when you rhetorically deny it, you are still bound by it. And so that's why at the dinner table, with his own child, as he was raising his child, presumably he wouldn't be comfortable if the child believed that arbitrarily beating up other children was a fine way to act, for example. Now, he might say something like, around here, we don't do that kind of thing, but I can't say absolutely everywhere. Arbitrary violence perpetrated by young kids against each other. Maybe there's some place where that's great. And there may be. But the point is that in his gut, his first reaction, his eye of value is like, I can't have my kid just arbitrarily beating up other kids. That's not a good person. And so there's a reliable differential responsiveness to value. Just like your eyeball reliably differentially responds to things in the world. You can gauge distance, again, you can gauge volume by looking at weight and everything. So but you have a reliable differential responsiveness to value. It's just not as simple. And so you have to get people into positions where the eye value is disclosed. And then you're someone who meditates a lot. In order to do that, sometimes you have to clarify your own mind and clarify your own ability to know what you desire, because it's only through clarified desire that value is observed. So like his kid is clear. He wants his kid to be a certain way. And parents who say, I don't want my kid to be a certain way are abnegating the responsibility of parenting, actually, which is a problem right now. The absence of a coherent discourse around value makes child raising impossible.
Yes.
So that's one of the places where I point to with people who would rhetorically deny value and then in practice not deny it. Now, if the rhetorical denial of value down propagates into disconnection from your eye of value, meaning that you really can't sense into the goodness or badness of a behavior, you're confused because there's some story you're telling about behavior and your body is telling you another story about its badness, but you can't meet these two things. And that occurs a lot with people who are heavily propagandized in the media in another way, with the disconnect between what they're seeing in reality and what they're being told is happening in reality. It's like really big. And so similarly, you are told in college or whatever that you're supposed to be a relativist and that no values are absolute. But you perceive in your body at times that there are things that are sacred and of absolute value, like your kid, your child. So now there's this deep incoherence in your own body mind between what you've been told the universe is like, which is that actually your kid is a meat machine that was randomly assembled by the universe, that it has no free will. That's what you're told, right? But your sense is not that no, that doesn't seem true. Actually, my kid seems to be uniquely valuable
Yes.
for his own sake. And the proper treatment of this child is a good greater than almost all other goods, despite the fact that from a kind of rationalistic, kind of like materialistic standpoint, he's just an arbitrary assemblage of atoms. So that disconnect between the scientific image of humanity, which is propagated as the only true one, and then the kind of postmodern relativistic ethic that kind of supervenes on it. The tension between that incoherent worldview and the already existing coherence of our eye of value creates a lot of neuropsis and problems and confusion. And the domain of child rearing shows that clearest through the reality of self-care and those kinds of things do it. So the long answer is like, yeah, this guy who would deny it, an architect could probably be, with a few drinks and a few long conversations, like brought to a different philosophical position. But there are other folks for whom the culture has saturated deep. And this is the meaning crisis, right? The nihilism gets to your bones. And you go into an identity diffusion disorder, you go into a whole bunch of things that are very painful and create a lot of pain for you, create pain for others. And it's an epistemic disease. It's an epistemic disease that accompanies the decline of civilizations. It's been seen in civilizational research. We've been doing, you get what's called a political Gnosticism, or just a Gnosticism. And a Gnosticism is basically a worldview that believes that this world is evil, that all of history is evil, that the ancestors are evil, that there's the thing God, the demiurge is evil. Yeah. And so the end state of the valueless culture is actually a Gnosticism, which basically condemns all prior history and condemns the current moment, and then exculpates all action because it's a victim. Like, I was tricked. I was put in here by a demiurge. I was tricked. I was trapped in an evil structure by my ancestors. I was tricked. I'm a victim. That's Gnosticism. And that consistently accompanies civilizations as they collapse. And you can understand why, because all of the bureaucracies start to degrade. The sense-making infrastructures at the core of the civilization start to degrade. The whole thing becomes confused. The worldview is incoherent. So that's a little bit of the situation we see now with the current culture wars, is a kind of degradation into states of political Gnosticism, the only resolution of which is like war, extreme war of all against all. Because it's not like, oh, I kind of understand how we could get into this and people are not evil and the world is not evil, but we make mistakes. And now it's like, no, there's evil here and you guys are evil. And probably this whole swath of history is evil. But again, the profound contradiction of removing itself, there's something in me that's not, that allows me to judge the world. That creates a tension. So again, the theme here is the incoherence of many worldviews, and the dominant one now being the dominant in terms of the ones coupled to the actors with the most power and money and influence, is the transhumanist ideology, which includes a whole bunch of views that most people think are nuts, but which are widely touted as the motivating drivers of most advanced technology innovation and venture capital investment. So all the guys who run the big AI firms are all of this ilk. They're transhumanists. They think that biology is well, and
we want the machine to take over. We like, it's like, no, it's not a bad thing. It's a kind of good thing.
It's a good thing, and it's the biological life is here to bootload the silicon life. And there's nothing intrinsically valuable about biology, and therefore my intelligence is substrate independent, so I can actually transfer my consciousness to the machine, and therefore go extraplanetary. And so they're actually willing to gamble all biological life in the interest of transforming it into silicon life, which makes them meaning transhumanist, meaning the human form is relative, meaning that it is not particularly valuable. It's not a, as the Buddhists would say, precious human vehicle that was built over billions of years of evolution. Like, like, come on, guys. But instead, they're saying, no, this is like slime compute. This is like messy slime compute, and we could actually run this on like a crystalline silicon compute, and we could be immortal on that substrate. And this one dies and gets sick, and it's terrible. So, like, obviously, we should destroy all the biological life as quickly as possible to build the enormous mainframes that we could send off into space that live immortally on. And that sounds like, wow, who the hell would think that? And you're like, hey, some of the most successful guys in our culture have been motivated by that worldview since they were young men. Founders of the X-Risk community, the founders of OpenAI,
Yes.
are precisely the ones who are gaining the asymmetric power and influence of the ones who have asymmetrically insane worldviews. And I'm trying to like spread the word, because my sense is if people knew like that guys like Sam Altman have chains around their neck that have a little dog tag on it that basically says, if I die, get me to this facility. This is a facility he has a stake in financially, which is a cryogenic facility, which will freeze his head in the interest of waking it up when computation and AI has advanced to the point that it can be used and he can upload his consciousness. So even if he fails now to make it uploadable, when he dies, he chops his head off, he freezes it, he makes it uploadable
Yeah.
at some. So this is
Yeah, no.
this is not like a sci-fi novel that he's writing.
Yes.
This is like a company that he's invested in, and he wears it around his neck. And he's sitting next to Jack Kornfield, and he's at Harvard, and he's talking to people as if what he's doing is kind of a normal human thing. But in fact, what he's doing is building the advanced technologies that will end humanity. So you got that. And the assumption there is that, again, biologists value this, that the given values that we have had encoded in us for millennia that have been the core of the sacred rites and rituals of the great traditions, and that those things are as arbitrary as anything else in the universe, and it's all. So it's like, it's a remarkable.
It's meaningless. Yeah, it's meaningless.
Exactly. And so that's kind of more just about how important the superstructure thing is, that it's hard to get that the philosophical worldviews are so important. It's somehow like, well, the oceans need cleaning up, and fucking there's wars on, like there's like pollution, and there's going to be civil, like all of that. Why aren't you focusing on that? You're like, yeah, but that's all in a sense downstream from.
Yes. The
Thing that sounds weird and kind of privileged to say, but yeah, at the same time, it's true. And all prior situations of transvaluation involved action on that. So the axial age is that's why it's called the axial age. It was actually this rollover of massive value, like worldview value change, learning process, meaning that like the overcoming of the prior value structure by a new one with the emergence of the Hebrew wisdom and the Buddha and all of these things. Key focus on superstructure, then down propagated into all these other things. So this is why the Renaissance play is useful. That said, it's possible that the infrastructure is so out of control that there's not time. There needs to be some small group that really does some really badass work at the level of superstructure just to stop the thing from falling apart. So that's a little bit more of just the centrality of the worldviews and the dominant worldviews. And of course, there's the old school fundamentalist worldviews, which also are
pre-modern, that
people who still think that the conflict in the Middle East is really just a sign of the apocalypse, and they would actually welcome a nuclear war because that would bring Christ back. And there are people who hold those beliefs seriously who sit in the United States Senate and stuff like that. So I'm not denying that, but I am saying that
yes,
the emergent tech elite is running on an equally crazy religious fundamentalism. It just calls itself scientific transhumanism. Right. So,
I mean, just to build on a couple of points, I mean, we used to use the metaphor of at life itself. It's like of the, I'm on the seashore and there's all this kind of like oil or, some pollutant, and I spend my time picking it up, but I need to go upriver. Fundamentally, while it can seem there's these very urgent things, basically the upriver, the cultural worldview sources, which is, I think, what you were saying at the end, that's why we kind of need to go there, because the argument I often use is the climate, obviously most people, I know many people involved I've done
Right.
stuff around the climate crisis, but this persistence, like, oh, we've known for a while, we've known what the issue is, we've got all this evidence. The issue is it's kind of rooted into the cultural, what I call it the cultural foundations, rather we're going the Marxist terminology other way around, but those foundations of civilization are rotten. It's no good just patching
Yes.
the wall. And that's the case,
Um,
or to mix our metaphors.
The feedback loops, right? So like the bad ideas in the superstructure down propagate into bad legal regulations, which allow architects to build hideous, dangerous, toxic buildings, right? And then that makes
Which
people,
form being?
right, which people be in, which then affects their psychological state, right? So there's this reinforcement that occurs. That's why, so it's very hard actually, excuse me. And the eye of value, if you're in a hideous toxic building, the eye of value will just shut off, usually to protect itself. If it stays open, you get really messed up. So you're just like, boom, I'm not interested in value here in terms of the beauty or well-being index. I'm just going to shut off and like do my work in my cubicle. So if you're telling that person like, hey, open the eye value, they're like, dude, I like where like shit. So you have to take them somewhere
Mhm.
to a place where it's overwhelming. And so that's why it is, yes, we have this focus on superstructure, but sometimes focusing on superstructure doesn't look like focusing on superstructure. Like in my second book, The Education and Time Between Worlds, I said, listen, most of the most impactful things we could do to better education would have nothing to do with fixing the schools. They would have to do with fixing labor markets, fixing neighborhoods, like fixing. And so similarly with this superstructure play, and that's why community building and architecture is a part of superstructure work if it's well conceived. So that's why there's this full stack thinking that has to be done, but you have to really think about superstructure. And often people who are really good at innovating in domains of governance and domains of infrastructure, like these things will move very quickly in the practical and get frustrated by, these deeper questions. So there needs to be that ability because at the end of the day, very difficult design decisions have to be justified. And the only way you do that is by going to higher discourse, which is a discourse of value, right? So like, how do you decide to not make a toxic building? It can't be because it's cheaper, because it's going to be more expensive to build a building that's not toxic. So if the only way you think about value is efficiency and expense, right? So how do we move to an accounting system that includes actual value?
Right. Okay. And this is, I don't know how familiar or not, Christopher Alexander, this architect in the pattern
Yeah,
language. I
yeah,
mean, I think of him as this great precursor because, the nature of order, I mean, it leads up, his fourth book, he has to be like, okay, I'm going to talk about this kind of
yeah,
this woo-woo stuff because yeah, you can really perceive wholeness, you can really sense stuff, and has this whole and in a way that Alexander, started obviously the timeless way of building is this early 70s, which says this as well. But his whole like arc of his life is a period when that's kind of in eclipse.
yeah, yeah. I
But
read A Timeless Way of Building. That was
yeah.
which
Huh?
was an early book, A Timeless Way of Building, right? That
Yes.
was, yeah, but I didn't look at that late. I haven't looked at the later stuff, but I've been,
Yeah, but the nature of order, the luminous ground, specifically goes through this. And what's fascinating for me though about Alexander is how why I like coming back to that is like concretely, how do we develop these qualities? Which he kind of because he goes into, and he also goes into the way they get enmeshed in system, right? Like you just can't build like, for example, how do you cultivate your eye of value in building, and how does it connect with reason? I just bring it up because I think that this is one of the places that yeah, it shows, to kind of come back to this question. I don't even want to go on about it, but how you have people discover this or these paths in, and like why the architecture example and Alexander's work is so interesting because people can see the built environment. It's very concrete, to excuse the
yeah,
metaphor. um,
architecture, music, nature, especially wilderness,
yes.
are things where it's like you can't not have it open. So a good architect will blow your eye value open. You won't even be trying to. You'll just be standing there and blown away. A bad architect will shut it up. It's like giant box with fluorescent lights and just hideous, and you'll just shut down. So yeah, there are ways that the built environment through ontological design, even technologies, but the nervous system was built to perceive value in nature. And so that's why I'm sure in the luminous ground, he speaks to the perception of wholeness and in nature.
Yes.
So
Is we
that's
have the whole thesis. He's got this whole attempt because the nature of order, those 4 books, which
right.
is like his masterwork, which supersede like his final stuff, is an attempt, I think, because of constant arguments he was having to try and ground with a scientific basis based on a science of the living. What is it? What is the living? And he has these 15 principles of kind of levels of scale, strong boundary, strong centers, bound, these kind of principles, and this idea of generation. The living is not designed, it is generated. An embryo does not start with a master plan of what my child will look like, but with sequences that build. Anyway, the thing is, he was this a kind of attempt to kind of have a scientific or a reasoned way in. And it's kind of funny because the 4th book of the Nature of Order, the 4-volume masterwork, has this part where he's kind of, I wasn't sure whether to put this in, but I'm going to now go on the kind of slightly spiritual direction, having had all this attempt to kind of have this reason-based effort, and say, I can't really kind of conceal this from you, that you really can sense something. There's something in the world that is real, that is alive, that is whole, that you can feel, but that which we deny that we can feel. We say it's just opinion or whatever. No, it isn't. And yeah, it's it's all, even the name, the luminous ground, is a
Right.
beautiful title of that one. I just want to kind of then, one question I want to say is like, can you tell, listeners a bit more about how this loss of value, this loss of, well, like this kind of value is all subjective, this loss of a sense of the realness of value, its universality, or the grammar of value, not maybe an individual value. How does that relate to the meta crisis? How does that relate to the breakdowns we've seen? I mean, you've given an example in the technological accelerationism a little bit, but could you describe in other areas how you see that connection playing out a little bit?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's worth talking about the difference between, before I do that, and to kind of make that possible, values and value.
Yes.
Because values is associated with like a list of values that are kind of like you just take on or something. What we speak of is value and the field of value and a grammar of value, which is and sometimes a story of value, which is this broader way of thinking about it, which allows for symbiotic relations between potentially polarizing values. Because like when you have the values discussion, usually it's my values versus your values. But if you have the field of value, then you're seeing that actually all the values exist in a field. There's each value has a certain uniqueness and relates to other values in certain constellations within a field or a grammar, which means it's legible, which means you can learn about the properties of the field the way you can learn about the properties of physical fields. And a lot of physics is now fields. What's weird is that fields are totally invisible, but in physics, and there's weird things that have to be set up to measure them, but we believe that, but these things, which actually you don't need any instrumentation, you just need a certain type of clarity of mind and desire. Our mind body is the greatest instrument to perceive fluctuations in the field of value. That's one of the things. It was McGilchrist might argue that that was one of the kind of like design parameters driving the evolution of the nervous system. It was actually its ability to attune to what is always already intrinsically valuable in the universe. And so we can do that. And for a long time, that was what like human education was about, that. Which I have to say, laughing because we're so far from that, but that was what you were when you were educated religiously, or ancient Greek, or ancient Mesopotamian, or whatever you were educated. You were taught things that were believed to be really true, and the values that were held were believed to be actually valuable. Now we look retrospectively and think differently about that. So that's the kind of thing to boot. You have to think about like field of value versus values. We're talking about this general field of value. And so we're talking about not the absence of particular values, which is what some people think, like, oh, if we just all had this particular set of values. That's not what we're saying. We're saying absence of access to a discourse about a field of value, where there's a grammar of value that would allow us to even begin to balance different values, begin to weave them together, hold them in tension. as opposed to pitting them against one another, which kind of takes each value out of the field of value, right? And so in the book, there's a couple of places where it's laid out this kind of weave between the causes of the meta crisis and value. And so there's actually many dimensions to it. One of them kind of mentioned was just the kind of like dominance in the quote unquote ruling classes of a certain type of anti-value philosophy. Another one, which I was alluding to here, is the polarization in the field of value, which makes good faith communication impossible. So there's a global intimacy disorder. The best way to speak to it, this is Mark's term. And the global intimacy disorder is a result of an inability to have actual intimacy, which is predicated upon shared value. Not that we hold the same values necessarily, but that we actually think the field of value exists, and so therefore we can have a good faith conversation about value. Because here's the thing, if you don't think the field of value exists, you have to rewind at the beginning where I said, then all education about value is propaganda, which means like, I can't actually talk to you about your value and my value being different, but there's no reasonable conversation to have, right? Like if you measure this piece of wood and we're building a shelf together and you measure a piece of wood and I measure a piece of wood and I get a different measurement than you and we're trying to build this shelf, I'm totally going to bring it to you with my tape measure and you're going to look with your tape measure. We're going to figure out how long is the piece of wood. If you hold some values that I think are nuts and I hold values that you think are nuts, in our culture today, we will reciprocally demonize each other and engage in bad faith communication because there's no sense that there's a grammar of value or a field of value that holds both values. So we have no choice but to basically put you outside of the field of empathetic concern. You become a crazy person, can't relate to. And then we use some thought terminating cliche to stigmatize and stereotype. So we're not talking about everyone adopting some singular set of values that beats some other set of values. The goal here is to establish the conditions for the possibility of good faith communication and reciprocal learning about value. That's what we're trying to do. And if you can't do that, then there's no intimacy, which means that you're just stuck in multipolar traps. You're just stuck in reciprocal demonization and non-learning. You're stuck in bad faith communication tactics. So, you know, the enemy hypothesis that drives so much of culture, so much of violence, is that it's an ability to put certain people outside the field of value. And it's a result of, so it's a thing that, you know, it's a thing that seems odd to address by having a philosophical conversation because it's the source of all violence. And yet it is the breakdown of the ability to hold the other as also in the field of value, even though you disagree with them, which what real empathy means. It's not like, let me empathize with how crazy you might be and try to talk you into my view, which is how a lot of people relate to other people. Like, oh, you poor indoctrinated person. They never think that they've been propagandized if they're emotionally polar, but they relate to others. No. But in fact, no, there's a much deeper relationship that allows for values to coexist in tension, in polarization. Not the collapse, of all of the wrong ones into the right ones. But in fact, no, there's moments of truth in both, moments of idiocy in both. Exiting any one from the field moves the polarity, which breaks the field. In fact, it's the tension between the values and the consistent holding of tension between the values in the field, in the grammar that's necessary, that creates growth and evolution of value. So that's our evolving perennialism, that value is eternal and developing. Meaning precisely through these confrontations of this seemingly impossibly to reconcile values, we get the emergence of new value, which is one of the things that the kind of conservative version of perennialist philosophy, or the conservative call to return to value, to return to pre-modern, misses. And that's the classic critique of value by postmodernity. Is like, well, look at how cultures evolved. Like, what are you talking about? There's some eternal love, or there's some eternal justice or something. And in fact, you just need to step out of that and look at it like a grammar. And what grammars do is set universal conditions that allow for unique linguistic expression and the evolution of language, even though there are these universal constraints. Now, those constraints slowly change, but many of them do not. So the grammar metaphor works well, and the field metaphor works well. Field also, things stay consistent, but fields move, evolve. So that's a little bit more on theory of value. And then I think another thing to think about is the alienation of the human from the natural world, when you understand human desire and value as somehow alien from the appetition of the cosmos, as Whitehead would say, meaning that like, oh, human is weird, perverse excretion of biosphere that we have no way to communicate with the biological in terms of shared need. Now, this is why people love their animals like pets, because they're not human, but there's a field of shared value with the pet. So if you understand what we're saying here, is we're saying that value preceded the emergence of the human, which means that like the biosphere is suffused with value. And so it's possible to live in a field of value, of a living field of value, which is the biological world. If you denude the biological world of value, then there's an alienation, which means it becomes only an object of manipulation. So the tree becomes $600 of lumber instead of being like actually infinitely valuable, right? Infinitely intrinsically valuable, as an expression of cosmos, as miraculously producing oxygen and holding the soil together and causing an environment for the birds to live in, none of which could be done technologically, all with one thing, the way the tree does it for free, growing there, and yet we cut it down. So there is that sense of the alienation of the human from nature is what also allows the metacrisis to persist. Because if we all had a sense of how intrinsically valuable it was, it would be so difficult to destroy. But actually, we're super like into destroying it, which means that we're not, the alienation from nature is very, very strong. So a couple of questions.
I guess one question I have also is, if I were kind of a little bit of a skeptic, I'd be like, but okay, wait a moment, people, isn't the climate crisis, the ecological crisis, just a collective action problem, isn't it? Didn't we trash ecosystems 5,000 years ago, or gather hunters, overhunted megafauna, the woolly mammoth went extinct? Why is this specific to like, or maybe not specific, but why is this loss of value which is happening in modernity? Or was it that like, medieval kings were also, or back in ancient Mesopotamia where they over irrigated, they cut down the trees and irrigated and it salinized the soil and there were the ecological breakdowns. Have they lost their sense of the eye of value as well? Or take me a bit through.
I mean, so yeah, it's not a simple growth to goodness story or a simple like fall from Eden story.
Yes.
It's neither of those stories. It's something much more complex where you get these rhythms rhythms in the emergence of anti-value and value, basically with an overall arc of learning, but also increasing danger and suffering.
Wisdom gap. We get more powerful, so we can do more damage when we're not in a good state.
But we also have learned about value, like
yes.
the emergence of the Renaissance, that last one with the capital R in Italy and stuff, and the movement of that up and through the 30 Years' War into the Enlightenment and modernity, that there was a lot of progress over pre-modern authoritarian theocentric value structures. So there has been learning in the domain of value. It's just that it's so painful to learn in the domain of value. Like the eye of value requires experience. And sometimes you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And so there have been things that we took for granted, like the overwhelming size and generosity of nature, which allowed us to be consistently out of touch with certain things for a very long time. And now we're realizing, oh my God, this is so much more valuable than any human ever understood it to be. Like, so that's possible that we're actually have had this like very weirdly distributed capacity for the perception of value. And I would argue that any post-Dunbar level civilization type thing runs through a cycle where early in the founding of that civilization, you have things that are based on the perception of the value, and then the civilization begins to degrade and then begins to run a simulation of value, then you get pseudo value, then that flips into anti-value, and then it actually becomes actively destructive and self-terminating. And civilizations have done that. There's been arcs of that, but then there's been these interstices, and there's been transvaluations where the value thing has also started to change, as we talked about with the axial age. The problem is that like most of the prior civilizations were doing active building based around value systems that were value systems, meaning that yes, they were destructive, but the reason they were destructive was for some value that they actually believed was part of the universe, right? So this is like maybe the flip that I'm pointing to that makes this situation novel with regards to difficulty of access to the higher value, which is that prior civilizations got degraded and their bureaucracies declined and a whole bunch of things happened, but never did you have a civilization that was like peak maximal technological innovation and growth at the time of peak maximal nihilistic denial of value. Most prior growth cycles occurred right when the civilization was most convinced that its values were actually eternally true. And now we are precisely saying all value is relative, just build, basically, as the tech bros say. And
exactly. This is the thing again. I mean, I was an economist for a while, not because I want to be an economist, but because, it was kind of, there's such a dominant discipline. But it's the one value, this kind of is an implicit value in modernity, which shows up in, it's totemic science, which is economics in my view, which is like utility, basically there's this implicit just more good stuff, but your good stuff is maybe different from my good stuff. But it's like chacun a son goût, de gustibus non est disputandum, this disease of the market, right? Which is, and this is where I think there are these sacred cows that are fascinating. I mean, the example, I thought of a couple of good ones. I mean, one is in Jonathan Haidt's book, which goes back to your example at the beginning, where this real story of this guy who basically puts an ad out, says, I'm looking for someone to come and be murdered and eaten by me.
yes.
And yet he actually recruits someone, they come, they video, he does this. And all the students are really struggling to say this is wrong. Like they all feel revolted. They all are like, they can feel this. And his example that the story of like rational morality versus our intuitive morality are so out of whack.
Exactly.
And the other one is of Thich Nhat Hanh, going to Google, and he's having this argument with this engineer about attention, like should they make, the devices less attention grabbing? And he's like to the engineer, like, listen, it would be better to have less attention, like notifications. And then it's like, but we can put the option in, but we can't default it for them, and Thich Nhat Hanh's like, no, it is better. And there's this incredible debate with the guys like, no, but how can we say that's better? Why would we be in any position? Like Thich Nhat Hanh's like this Zen master being like, no, it's not like I know the absolute truth. I'm not being attacked, but there's right, and I joke sometimes with people I interact with who are young Buddhists, like it's called the Four Noble Truths, not the Four Noble Opinions, which is, this aspect. So I think this is such a great point of the disease event. I wanted to ask you maybe one point that's also interesting. There's both this aspect you're saying that the kind of maybe the fundamental value right now is of anti-values, you say, and that's rare in human history. There's always before been at least acceptance of a field of value, even if then the grammar was, what emerged is then dominant. We're off.
You always had anti-value. And again, like this is where you get demonology and the Tower of Babel and a bunch of things. Like it was known from the ancient Mesopotamian city-states that eventually this thing starts to misunderstand itself, break down, become evil, cause a lot of problems. There was just a lot, we could absorb a lot of city-state collapses. You can only absorb one planetary civilization collapse, right? So there's an urgency here. So I interrupted you. I just want to make it clear that the model is that it goes way back. We're just at a point of extremity now with these things.
Yes. Yes, I mean, that I feel is also, just to be fair to modernity, it's like, it's not like we're so much less wise than, like, I don't know, during the 100 Years' War, I was just reading about, but it's that they couldn't blow up the planet, they couldn't do, and so this wisdom gap issue combined with it is relevant. But I want to come to another question for you, which is maybe the positive side of the fact we're even having this conversation, which is on the other side. My sense is that there weren't a lot of Romans, and there were a lot of Romans. Always there was talk of decay and things were better before, but there wasn't this kind of, at least in some people, this awareness of what's happening. We didn't have we didn't have the information kind of culturally or socially in previous civilizational crises, maybe of the level, or this awareness maybe of the potential of, we could call it cultural evolution, conscious evolution, our ability to reset. I mean, would you say that's correct? I mean, I'm putting it forward as a proposition.
Yeah, I mean, you
Which
had
this kind of conscious cultural evolution or conscious evolution is novel, maybe.
I think so. I mean, there's a long arc here, and I want to get back to the point about economics because that's actually key. But so you have encoded in ancient civilizations myths of civilizational collapse, right? So Atlantis is one of the most famous ones, and Atlantis is talked about like as if it was just some place. It wasn't, but it became a myth. And then you have the flood myths, and the flood myths are from the Bible, but the flood myths are actually everywhere. Gilgamesh, exactly. So the flood myths are deep, and the flood myth is an obvious thing that would occur to ancient Mesopotamian. So, like in the Fertile Crescent, you had these rivers. It's what Mesopotamia means, I think. And then on those rivers, you had these city-states. Now, the whole point of the river is that it flows in one direction, which means you do all of your gathering upstream. So you do all the logging upstream. You do all the agriculture and weird stuff upstream, which means you're degrading all of the soil bases upstream, which means now every day rainfall is going to cause a flood, right? So there's captured in the mythic, but you see that pattern? It's like you always do that upstream, and then it's just every time it happens, and they record it in myth. But they record it in myth as if like there's no stopping that, because that's how God works. That's basically the myth, is basically there's no stopping. You can kind of maybe prepare for that, but this is kind of how it works. And then you have, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah by God, and you have just a whole bunch of contexts in which the patterns are recognized to be like gods. Like the patterns are recognized to be inescapable dimensions, which are kind of like foisted upon us, but they're captured. We have cultural memories of it. With the axial age, you get the overcoming of that form of myth into something new. This is a complicated argument. René Girard makes this case quite well, where they start to say we have to stop repeating history. We have to stop repeating history. Basically, they start to say that. And you go out of the cyclical, mythical, and into the historical thing, where we have to get out of the repeating history. And the Christian tradition is very specific because of in the Solomonic wisdom tradition, Hebrew tradition, you get the prophets. The prophet comes up, he's like, hey, the fucking flood's gonna come, like, stop doing this, like, we've seen this, and they kill him, right? And then Jesus does that same thing, and then he gets killed, but then we say we shouldn't have killed him. Everyone says we shouldn't have killed him. And so that's turning the repeating of the scapegoat thing, which becomes a way to just solidify culture. And Girard kind of pops the scapegoat thing. It's just like, see, out of myth into new history, into the possibility of not killing the prophet, and the possibility of listening to the prophet, to resolving the multiple trap. And so that lesson, with the emergence of the actual age religions, you get this idea that we don't have to repeat history, but you also get apocalypses, which are divinely dictated, morally ordered ending of world realm, which is not existential risk. Existential risk is scientifically wrought, possibly arbitrary, probably from violence, massive technological end to all humans, not God, precisely not morally ordered.
Yes. We've become
that thing doesn't come online until like probably Mary Shelley in the 1880s writes The Last Man or something like that, which was a book that involved repurposing the new idea that species could go extinct, which like Thomas Jefferson didn't believe that species could go extinct, which is interesting to think about that. And then not that long later, like almost 2 decades later, Darwin, et cetera, you get this that, oh, there have been extinctions, there's a fossil record, the humans are a biological species, the humans could go extinct. It's a completely different thought that God will come down and end things and bring me up to heaven and morally sort out the good guys from the bad guys. And this is no arbitrary meteor, arbitrary pandemic, mass violence, human goes extinct, we join the fossil record. That's a relatively new thought, but that allows for what you just mentioned, which is the reflection on how to stop that from happening. Like for the first time, you're like, no, history cannot repeat itself. We don't want to become the dinosaurs. Like, of course, we haven't focused mostly on stopping the actual X risks that come from living in a universe like ours. So like meteorite protection, super volcanoes, pole shifts, like radiation from the central galactic sun. Like there's a whole bunch of stuff that if we were a mature civilization, we'd be worried about that. We're worried about Sam Altman, who wants to cut his head off and freeze it, now having billions of dollars, but to pursue a super intelligence. So it's like, okay, we got a lot of problems to solve before we actually start solving the problems that we were presented with by virtue of just being on this planet, which have been a threat. So that would be the conscious evolution thing, which is that, well, we know now that there will be massive climate changes as a part of being on this earth. We know that now. We didn't always know that. Like we know now there will be periods of massive volcanism. There will be periods of massive solar storms. So we know that, so we can work to prevent that, which means we don't have to go extinct for the reasons that other large extinctions occurred. Now we are also causing the large extinctions now and increasing the probability of causing our own extinction. And so that's this field of X risk, which isn't really the field of conscious evolution, because it's like we are responding to our anthropogenically caused risk, different from naturally caused risk, like the Yellowstone super
Yes.
is the anthropogenically caused risk, which is nuclear weapons, AI, synthetic biology, that kind of thing. So yeah, we're in a critical choice point. I'd say it's been about 100 years where we could even make a choice of this type, right? And now that choice has become way more complex. Like we could have done some very serious stuff back in like the 40s with the bomb that would have made this moment of the emergence of artificial intelligence much less dangerous.
Yes.
But we did not do that. And so now we're very perilous in a situation where a flood is coming and we're just going to repeat history again. And that the like philosopher, priests, kings have gone insane, and that the military class is for sale, and that the everyday people are under the boot. This is, a story that has been occurring before. So we haven't learned the lessons even of the axial traditions. And theirs was, you don't repeat history by becoming a new kind of human. And that's kind of the message of David J. Temple, which is the emergence out of Homo sapiens of something else, which we would call homo-more, which would be constitutionally differentiated from the previous as a result of that transvaluation.
I mean, there's 2 points I just, again, maybe the tiny hope, the way I use it in the second-renaissance stuff we've been doing is this kind of darkness before dawn, but also the metaphor of maybe personal transformation, in general, when you ask people when they shifted ontologically or in their being, when they really changed their own view or their way of behaving, maybe it's their, a parent died, maybe it was a difficult separation, maybe it was losing their job. Sadly, it seems that often major kind of growth personally happens after these traumas. And I guess there's this kind of aspect where, if things were not too bad, we talk about these at the moment also here at Life Itself, these 3 parts, there's the story of a little bit, sometimes either there's collapse or it's like, oh, we kind of do this, we kind of dodge the climate crisis bullet. But there's also something where there is kind of some breakdown, but it's not so catastrophic that it's the end, but that out of that, there's this major growth moment. And I think when we look back, the classic example of the Renaissance that we also use, not only was there the Dark Ages, which, but the Renaissance came after the disastrous 14th century in Europe. There was the Black Death, there was famine, there was this huge breakdown at the end of the High Middle Ages. Not that this is anything we would want. We would always desperately want to avoid any of these things. But the one thing to say is that sometimes the greatest catalyst to our evolution, unfortunately, have been kind of breakdown. It's but that one phrase, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger." The issue is it can be particularly since we burnt through, a large amount of the free energy surplus we kind of had in the form of fossil fuels and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It takes a complex civilization to create photovoltaics.
Yeah, no, I agree. And this is my basic model that things will get worse before they get better, that it will be some type of crisis that initiates the breaking out of the brainwashing or whatever into opening the eye of value into a greater sense of urgency. So I think that will occur, but we're in a different situation. The other times that we've run that gauntlet,
it's not planetary. Yeah,
not everything has been on the line. Basically, now everything is on the line. And when we previously did that, we weren't dealing with a class of people who were capable and able to and willing to, motivated to gamble all of biological life, which is what we're facing now. So that is, I think, another thing that makes it urgent. But that said, there is this swing that we see coming between chaos and oppression, basically. So there'll be catastrophes that occur, but the response to the catastrophe is increasing control structures, right? But the control structures make more fragility, which can create kind of a worse kind of catastrophe, which makes for more control structures. So the idea that it goes all Mad Max, or that it kind of goes all kind of like 1984, it's actually going to be this swing, which could be terrible for hundreds of years. That's more likely than things kind of staying more or less.
yes.
And the problem with the AI, one of the main problems with the AI risk, aside from the environmental risks, are the risk of locking in the oppression trapped.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that allowed for prior civilization breakdown was kind of the escaping of and uprising of the masses, basically. But the kind of like perfection of cybernetic control systems and surveillance that could be enabled by AI could make that impossible.
Am I laughing because the severity? I mean, I want to ask, just to go back to a comment you made just before, because I think it's a nice moment to also kind of come a bit to like, what is wise action? You said after the Second World, in the Second World War, the birth of nuclear weapons. Now, I was about to say, like, you said there was this missed opportunity because kind of what we got out of it was like basically non-cooperative game theory and like, mutually assured destruction. What would have been like the kind of thing that would have been great? And therefore, you see now, and I guess the other phrase I'm going to bleed to that we also sometimes use, the seeds of the second renaissance. Now I joke sometimes, okay, winter's coming and so is spring. Like you have to retain some hope and like you're planting seeds. Either that might make winter, there's food through winter, or it might last till spring. But these two questions, like what would it have been done? Just going back in a historical thing, what would have been amazing? And that might be also some kind of patterning for now, even now. So yeah, tell me a bit more about what you'd like to have seen.
So it's a very complex question. So the post-war order established at Bretton Woods, which is right over here in New Hampshire by where I am. I've been to this place. It's actually a really beautiful, huge hotel. And they signed their documents that made the US dollar the global default currency and put in place things like the IMF and what would become eventually the United Nations. And what we know is a post-war global order. It's kind of created there. Whole history to that. Some of what was done there just wasn't followed through on. Like some of the ideas there were obviously just in America's interest and were colonialist, but other of the ideas were in fact very important, and those revolved around international regulatory agencies and international governance. So we ended up building out a really robust international financial system and proceeded to then make most of the rest of the world indebted to the first world, specifically America. but we didn't put teeth on the international legal apparatus. We didn't put teeth on the UN. The UN never got a standing army, for example. The UN never got the budget to attract the most badass scientists in the world, for example. They were still paid for by the military industrial complexes of respective countries, and the standing armies were still completely manned by basically at that point two superpowers. So there was this kind of like opportunity there specifically. There were many others, which I can't speak to in economics and other places where things could have been set up in a way that was much more like cohesive and not so American. I mean, America kind of quote unquote won the war, and they're kind of like, yay. And then so they built the post-war order in a way that really just benefited them a lot. Even though they could have been a much more of a jerk, because for a time they had the biggest bombs. So they could have. So there is some example there. But the thing I really want to point to is the absence of an existing international regulatory agency to deal with existential advanced technology. That was the main thing, because we had our first instance of that with the A-bomb. And
Yeah.
at that time, people were like, oh, this is a class of thing. Now we make stuff that can kill everybody. Like, who should be in charge of deciding what to do about that shit? And you got the League of Atomic Scientists and other things focused on the bomb. And you got attempts by places like the United Nations to start to convene what they can convene as conferences, but conferences don't do anything. What you need to convene is actually, no, the most intelligent scientists don't work for the military apparatus or private companies. They work for a regulatory agency that monitors the development of advanced technologies at global scale. And then they're just staffed there, right? You could have done that. They could have then backed the regulations proposed by the most advanced scientists in the world who were put in a position to do work on the interest of all of humanity instead of work on the interest of a particular nation state or capital itself. These most advanced scientists recommend regulations for advanced technology, which could have been backed by international rule of law and some way of dealing with correlation of force and means in terms of getting enforcement on these things. So we never had that. And what we had instead was accelerating arms races of destructive advanced technology.
Yes.
And no ability late in the game to put in place anything like an international regulatory apparatus that could govern those dangerous technologies, and the capture of all the most advanced minds by capital and state interests. And so therefore the United Nations being both stupid and without teeth is a huge problem. No, I'm not proposing a one world government system, obviously. Anything, I hope I've said enough to make it clear, a more nuanced view on that.
Yeah.
But the broader point that the situation with advanced technology was known in the 40s and now is like completely biting us in the ass, that we really are just in multipolar traps with the advancement of the most risky technologies ever created, when we could have been in a situation of preemptive preparation, scientific kind of like regulatory apparatus that, and so there's just another world that would have required a lot less bad faith communication and a lot more cooperation in the interest of having a planetary civilization that exists for a long time, rather than competition in the interest of winning a short-term race for economic and military superiority, which at the moment seems like the most pressing thing. But as soon as you go back out, you see, actually, no, that's not going to work. And yeah, I mean, you could argue China has taken the longest view on these things, but we're forced into a situation of having to operate this way. But you could also argue that Moore's law forced everybody's hand into a situation of like rapidly accelerating arms races on dangerous technology, unless there was something that made that not possible or super expensive, which would have been put in place like in the 50s or 60s. But it wasn't. For many reasons. So I'm not saying like, yeah, that could have easily been done. So
No, it's not. No, you're not saying it's easy. But I think the thing that I would then ask, which is, I think there's this kind of collective action problem. You know, as an economist, this is like the kind of core of all of these issues. It's like people cooperating for some benefit, but it's, you know, there's a value deviation. Like, okay, it would all be great to have this regulatory agency, but hey, we, you know, even out of fear, like we need our stronger nuclear part. You know, what will they do? What will the Soviets do? what I want to kind of draw on, I guess, for me, because I came out of, before I got maybe more into this cultural, the superstructure argument that we need this transformation in our being is really the root, of path to like deep social improvement, radical, so, improvement in flourishing in our planetary situation. I'd be like, okay, there are these kind of, okay, these collective action problems, they've always been around. We've got a bit better at actually solving them. What I see is that there's been this huge, just I'm kind of asking you, is like, okay, so there's been this huge actually growth, this because of the wisdom gap, because technology's taken off, there's been this huge need for us to be able to cooperate better.
Yep.
And I want to ask, because there's obviously something related to this kind of evolution in being, the switch from or the evolution from Homo sapiens to homo-more. How do you think that shows up in being able to address these collective action problems? So we're talking because it's like, okay, this, how will it enable human cooperation at a different scale, do you think, and why?
Well, that's kind of the story another plot line in that story from ancient Mesopotamia to nuclear weapons, is that the transvaluations were always about resolving prior unresolvable social traps, basically.
Yes.
The movement out of myth and towards integrative symbology. So like Christianity really did it so well, you almost think it's like a psychological operation run by, like, because they just merge all of this prior symbolism from different traditions into not something that's not a myth, which allows people to be like, well, how can I trust that dude from that tribe that I used to disagree with? Well, he's actually a Christian now, even though many of his customs are very, very different and I've never met him. He's a Christian. So I think that is one way to think about the process now, that homo-more would be precisely that form of human being that resolves the current social traps and unresolvable dilemmas. And so there's a depth of transvaluation that allows for literally just the disintegration of the boundaries that used to characterize the competition, because now there's this bigger story of value, if you will, which becomes possible. Now, how to do that is complicated under conditions of conscious evolution, because the prior emergence of these worldviews were, at least retrospectively, seemed to be very organic, and like it was not clear that Christianity was going to win out against like Mithraism and a couple other
Zoroastrianism or whatever. Yes, there was.
And it's not even clear who composed many of the foundational texts, and this is where David J. Temple also becomes interesting. Like, one of the things you see in periods of civilizational transformation is the emergence of occluded and collective authorship. So like, who wrote the Upanishads? Like, who wrote the Talmud? Who wrote the Bible? Who wrote, the Zohar? Who wrote the, like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's very important for this time. It's a little bit of a diversion, but yeah, the broader point I want to get back to is that the other thing that allowed me to trust you at a distance without ever having met you is economics.
Yes.
Is measurement and money, and specifically fungible currency. And I think this, to me, is one of the deepest generative dynamics of the meta crisis, is the global spread and enclosure of all value transaction into a single fungible currency. And what that allows for is a complete distortion of the nature of reality, a complete reduction of all choice architecture to a very, very, very narrow metric. And then eventually that building an enormous planetary machine that transforms all of nature into this weird abstract thing. And so that, to me, is something that would have to occur for this would be a movement to a very different type of economic system, very different type of accounting, and a very different types of currency. And so homo-more is, in fact, in part, the social being that emerges on the other side of this economic transition. Because many of our most habituated behaviors are the result of our languages being distorted by money as the main language of value and metric of value. Please. Yeah.
Well, I think, because this is something that also is really interesting to me, and I think there's a relationship to the value point and to Christopher Alexander and McGilchrist in your work. So let me explain it, is to say, the issue you have when you have this discussion with people is like, so I was an economist, I did social cost benefit analysis, and you kind of like, okay, when we compare apples and oranges, or let's say in this future society, when we transcended the broken economic system we have, how do we decide whether to build schools or hospitals
Right.
or build roads? And like classically today, it's like, okay, well, we're going to reduce things to some common metric because otherwise you can't compare them on the real line, right? And we can kind of, which is money. Now good economists will say money isn't like what you think of as money. It's just a money metric utility function, right? It's just our unit, denomination for our thing. But there's this aspect where clearly, we want to go beyond something unidimensional
Yep.
without collapse. But we do still need to make choice or decisions. We will need to make collective group choices about things, right? And this is where Christopher Alexander, architecture and wisdom and this field of value, I think is so central, is you are going to essentially in a world, you say, okay, well, you're going to want to do things that nourish value in the true sense. And there might be like, that's not a single metric. You said it's not one value, but this field of value. But the thing that's kind of, I think, is intriguing that people have today and why the epistemology, ethics all come together. And I'm saying things you're saying. It is that, okay, well, today, when I don't agree with you, we can convert, like, okay, we convert things into money and we do stuff. I don't have, but in this future world, my point is we don't elect Zen masters. The metaphor I use, we don't elect Zen masters through some like objective assessment, but it's neither subjective or objective or it is objective. It's like you said, is this person awakened or something like that, right? Or there's this aspect where there's a group decision of practitioners who are able to sense into something real, but not reducible to physical observable characteristics. And that similar thing happens in this field of value, or I say about wisdom. You thought of the metaphor, we need to go, this quality, which we could call wisdom, will be this ability to sense the kind of things that have value. Today, because we don't trust any field, we reduce it to money and these things that we can convert into money. And then my money's the same as your money, but you might buy different things with it. But if we're deciding, let's say in the future, today, to decide whether we build the hospital or the road, we're like, okay, let's calculate the cost in money. We'll do some weird estimate of like number of life years saved or number of people who drive on the road, convert it into some money utility, like the value of a statistical life is €1 million. So if this road saves a lot, we'll do this. But in the future, we need some ability for groups and therefore to work out the value of those things and collectively by sensing into this field of value. Right. But to do it in ways that are self-correcting, that avoid abuse by someone who says, I know the value. Oh, but coincidentally, it's exactly what I want to do. Right. Which is what you see in communities of practice. And to bring it back to the Alexander example, if I say, okay, what I value is wholeness or beauty in buildings, we need some way for society to evaluate that in the building permit, rather than saying, oh, your density per plot is less than this, and you're not building higher than 3 stories, and you're complying with fire regs. We'll have that stuff in some way, but we'll also be like, but does the building bring wholeness to the area? But who will decide that? And that's where this ability and some communities of practice and ways of assessing, you talked about clarifying the eye of value, is going to be so crucial. So I wondered, do you have any thoughts on that, of like how, like socially and politically, this could look like? Because the crucial thing to going beyond our current economics is a new way of sensing and kind of, I don't see comparing, but when there are moments of choice or discussion in the political sense, the true sense of politics, of making decisions together, how would we do that in the homo-more? What will their new economics look like and their new choices about schools or hospitals?
Right. Yeah, sometimes when I get criticized of being like against capitalism or something, I'm kind of like, dude, I would actually give me a free market. Actually, give me like one of those nice kind of like, Smith markets where there's information symmetry between consumers and producers. Because then you get a marketplace that's sending economic signals that is like sense making. Like if you actually, so you have to get that, the market, and yeah, I say not you because you get it because you're economics, but like I'm saying to the listeners, whoever, that a properly functioning market and the whole notion of supply and demand and these things balancing, that's not what occurs right now. We have something that is not a market, no, certainly not a free market. in the sense of that technical definition. We have manufactured demand at a very, very profound rate, and therefore distortion of the ability for the market to act as an actual signifier of real value can only act as a signifier of basically commodity foreign value, or like exchange value, if you will, if I just revert to simple Marxist terms, but like actual use value, real value, is occluded from view intentionally, because then everything would fucking flip on its head and it would get really weird. So there's a very interesting way in which the signaling mechanism of a properly functioning market is a really good sense-making tool. And this is what free market capitalism and libertarians and stuff, this is what they're trying to say. They're like, come on, guys, like, and to which I'm saying, well, then, like, you really are not in that situation. Like, you have to change a lot of things, including like corporations being people, and these tax breaks, like a whole bunch of stuff, and these advertisements, and they don't want to do that because they're interested in making money. They're not interested in running a properly functioning economy. So there's that. There is, yeah, it would be possible to actually, by putting in place regulations around advertising and a whole bunch of other stuff, set up a situation where consumer choice behavior would actually put the economic distribution in touch with real, like actual reality of what people want and what people need, as opposed to being coerced by advertisements and other things into warping the sense making of what actually is valuable and what is needed. So there's that. There's in the future, there'd be something like that. Now, the deeper problem with that is what you mentioned, which is that actually requires kind of like an educated populace. And this is one of the reasons that we have the sense-making crisis. And one of the reasons people are kept out of more capacity psychologically is in order to make them more manipulable in the marketplace. So what you would need to do is something that's sometimes called like basically liquid and qualified democratic choice making. Liquid meaning you don't bundle choices, you decouple choices, meaning you don't vote on a proposition that actually includes several different things. You take them apart. And qualified meaning that you only get to vote, and it's probably should be ranked choice voting, but qualified would mean you only get to vote if you actually know something about this. And that's complicated, but very, very important for a proper functioning economic / collective choice making operation. So like if the question is about a school being put in, who's actually qualified to think that through? Not everybody. It gets even more complex when the decisions are scientific decisions. Like, should these electrical wires be put in? Like, should this bridge be made out of this kind of material or something, right? And you precisely can't have everybody answering those questions because they have no idea. And this happens all the time. Like in California, they're putting on the budgets questions about the electrical grid in California, but it's like none of the citizens know how the electrical grid in California ought to work. There's like a small number of them who know how it ought to work. And so this has been a problem again since post-war, of this kind of tension between democracy and expertise, basically, and the limiting of expertise to scientific expertise, because the deeper question you're asking isn't how do we get engineers to vote on engineering questions, but how do we get people who are the wisest in the community to be the ones who are entrusted with the most responsibility in decision making. And that's a very important question, the question of how to get those people who are most likely to be good leaders, who are also most likely not to therefore pursue leadership, to get them into a position to being upvoted and upregulated by their communities, to be empowered to make consequential decisions that require wisdom rather than like technical expertise. And that's a solvable problem with the current technologies. It's hard to supplant the existing political inertia, which characterizes political agency in a certain way, basically attracts sociopaths and narcissists to political agency, meaning like, if you're going to be an elected official, that's likely that. Why are you attracted to the job of being an elected official? So there's a little bit of that. That's a little bit hand wavy, but like I said, liquid and justified democracy in combination with a marketplace that has actual symmetry of information between consumer and producer, and then that coupled to legal regulations and other things around what production can look like and stuff like that. But again, we're quite far from that. Like, and this question of what like would motivate us to so radically change our basic financial infrastructure, it would have to be a very, very serious financial collapse, basically. Right? We have to think about rebooting the thing.
Mm.
But that financial system alone, like so much of it is fictitious capital. So much of it is not actual assets, but all of these kind of like collateralized derivatives or whatever they're called. So it's an enormous bubble that once it breaks would give us the opportunity to like rebuild the thing.
Well, and the bubble of in the sense of anticipated cash flows, even like real ones in the world, which, you know, it's captured. You ring up your pension fund, say, what do you think about the climate crisis? In my experience, they don't, oh, we're still going to get 7% a year or whatever. I wanted to come to one maybe last question, then we kind of close today, was what do you see as ways of like cultivating the seeds of the second renaissance or of homo-more and this new culture? Obviously you're pursuing, you know, you have a particular calling around sharing the vision, the philosophy, so on. But what would you say to like others? What are ways to kind of cultivate these seeds, would you say, that you see, or things that you see emerging that you
let's see here. So you have to figure out where you are and what your capabilities are. So there's no general advice really, except what I'm about to give, which is general advice, which is, you know, figure out where you are, what you're capable of. And the other advice that I tend to give is there are memories and rituals and practices that open the eye of value that are still accessible. And many of these have been kind of protected in the great traditions. So if you can find access to a real ritual context, a real context where the sacred can be invited to be disclosed, that's important. And some people have allergies to religion, in which case you have to find some other place, probably nature. But we still have a great asset, a great legacy in some of these traditions, which I think are part of that renaissance. Is not the jettisoning of them, but actually they're somehow being resuscitated. So explore in not the arbitrary postmodern space of spiritual consumerism, but explore in those places where you can be part of a ritual that has been more or less performed that way for a very, 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 very long time, like thousands of years or something. That's what makes some Buddhist rituals and kind of Hebrew rituals and other things. It's like, okay, this is interesting. This is not arbitrary advertisement or something. Like this has been, we've been doing this way for a very long time for a very good reason now. It may make you uncomfortable, you may not agree with it, and yet we have done this for a very, very, very long time. So that discomfort may actually be important, right? Rather than a sign that this thing is wrong. The discomfort you experience in the ritual context is your hardened eye of value trying to open, trying to see what this ritual has disclosed for, 3,000 years or something in some cases. So engage in actual ritual context to the extent that you can. So that's one. I think a real big one is like try to find ways to get into the kind of evolutionarily customary environment, which is a fancy way of saying avoid screens. That's huge, and it's very, very, very simple, but very, very, very hard to do because of the way the technologies have been designed. But I would argue that, yeah, part of this is a big detoxing off of the technological utopianism that has characterized the culture for a long time. So perceive technology as toxic, basically. Don't perceive technology as cool, useful, net beneficial, net healthy. Perceive technology as toxic. It doesn't mean it's going to kill you immediately. It might actually be fun. Like a lot of drugs are just toxins that you introduce into the body. But perceived technology as toxic, relate to it, therefore, in that way, often as a shamanic instrument, often kind of like as a drug, meaning like, okay, I'm about to fucking go in here. This is going to be crazy. No human in history has ever had a thing they can put in the palm of their hand and look at everything from like the deepest philosophy to like pictures of naked girls, which you can just go and it's in this hand. There's like thousands of millions of endless things. Like that's not an everyday thing. That shouldn't be normal for us. That should still be like, okay, like say a couple of prayers of protection, like think about yourself, then kind of like, okay, here we go. Like as if you were taking a psychedelic, which is why I think it should be, very, very careful with kids with these things. Very, very much. Like right now, we're just giving it out to kids as if like giving mushrooms out to little kids or something. So what are you doing? Like this thing will cause brain damage, especially for young nervous systems. So yeah, so there's a need to kind of understand the intensity of these advanced technologies and their effect on our nervous system, which I'm not saying don't use it. I'm just saying see it for what it is, not for what it tells you it is. And that's generally the truth for most of the big things that are impinging upon your life. You have to see them for what they are, not for what they're trying to tell you they are. So right now, like mainstream media in the United States is still trying to tell me that like this is where the facts are found, this is where the truth is found. Like I'm definitely not going to believe that story you're telling me about yourself. And similarly, the economy, the AI guys are telling you things about AI that they want you to believe about AI, but you should not believe the things they are telling you. The schools make you stupid and the medicine makes you sick and the money makes you poor. But they tell you these different stories about those things. That the schools will make you smart, the money will make you rich, the medicine will make you healthy. So you have to be on alert. These times of civilizational collapse, it is often the case that the very institutions that were created to care for the commons and the public good are now predatory upon the commons and the public good. And so Facebook being free, many of the social media things being free and presented as if they are like a public good providing access to communication at some type of town square or something. So again, you can't believe the story these things are telling you about what they are. Facebook is not that. TikTok is not that. So there's a vigilance that's necessary at this point that will allow your eye value to remain open and not be capturable. And that's key, almost a presupposition for anything else. But again, this is like almost impossible advice to follow because of the way that things have become inescapable parts of our everyday lives. That's by design. Very, very, very quickly compared to other tech. That took 50 years for televisions to get into every house. And then they were like these big, weird, clunky things. And it was like, and even then, you didn't have one in every room. That took until the 90s, probably, or something like. And so with here, now instantly, boom, 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 integrated into your workflow, integrated into your fucking driving and car and your fucking diet and your refrigerator. So there is a sanity check on the rate at which the forced repurposing of your behavioral routines by technology updates is acceptable. Now, if you're in a fucking work environment where they force you to, it's a different conversation. But if it's for your own entertainment that you're readily being rehabituated behaviorally by a new update, just think about that. And they're not arbitrary. The left-right thing is not arbitrary. The display on the screen is not arbitrary. Skinner is the most important psychologist of the 21st century in terms of the behavioral reinforcement that's enabled by these things. So that's technology is toxic, basically, would be the argument. So that's probably enough. Probably.
Yeah, I mean, we should, I think also in opening that eye of value, your point about rich is also then finding others who resonate with, like when you seeing something different from others, from the mainstream, to nourish that, to sustain it is often hard. But yeah, that's amazing, Zak. I just want to say thank you so much for the podcast. Is there anything last you'd like to say before we close for today?
Well, no, what you said is very important. That's why I was emphasizing sacred community context where real rituals done, like Zen meditation is such a great example, because at first you sit there like, why the hell is this? What are you doing? What is this? Why is this valuable? And then at a certain point, like the intrinsic value of the ritual becomes clear, but it only becomes clear in context with other people where everyone's seeing it. You realize they've been seeing it for a long time. It's like this revelation of pre-existing intrinsic value. So yeah, I would say, yeah, good luck to everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. It was good.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to